Hello, fellows. Greetings from New York. My name is Asha Aravindakshan, Sloan Fellow Class of 2017, and I'm thrilled to welcome back leadership and career transition expert Michael Watkins to speak with our Sloan Fellows program alumni and students. Quick housekeeping. You are on mute and your video is turned off. You can use the Q&A button in the menu at the bottom of the screen to ask questions during the session. The session will run a full hour with Michael's presentation and your questions. Following the session, you will receive an email from the Office of External Relations with the recording and a link to a landing page with the slides and articles referenced by Michael. Michael, as a reminder, will be joined by mid-career executives that have spent a full 12 months in residence at MIT Sloan in an MBA program that focused on magnifying their impact as leaders. They work for Global 2000 companies, family businesses, and some their own startups in over 40 countries around the world. And they're constantly reinventing themselves for the next chapters of their career. The first 90 days serves as a Bible of sorts to us as leaders moving forward in our careers. I've read it with my last few transitions, and each part of its roadmap resonates in different situations. For those of you hearing from Michael for the first time today, you're in for a real treat. A quick intro. Michael is a leadership transition expert specializing in C-level coaching. He's based in Switzerland, where he teaches at the IMD Business School and runs a leadership development consultancy called Genesis. He's an author of many leadership articles, which you'll hear about today, and books like The First 90 Days and Master Your Next Move, which we featured on our inaugural webinar on June 4th. Michael, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Asha, and welcome everybody. I'm coming to you from Zurich, Switzerland today, where I've been holing up since the COVID crisis began, but I'm really delighted to be able to speak with you today about really my favorite subject, which is accelerating leadership transitions. And I should say as background, you know, if you look at your careers so far, and I think you are experienced leaders, you've probably been through multiple transitions so far, right? And so you've certainly learned something about how to make successful transitions into new leadership roles, lots of good lessons, lots of good experience. And yet each new transition is different. Each new transition presents you with unique challenges. And sometimes, you know, what got you here won't necessarily, as Marshall Goldsmith so aptly put it, get you there. And so it's just stepping back and thinking a little bit about your experience with transitions, you know, how many jobs have you had so far in your career? I sometimes talk in terms of leaders' cycle time. What's the average time in position? These days, you know, well, since COVID, it's changed again, but even before COVID, many of the organizations I was working with, leaders at the VP level were averaging, you know, 2.5-ish years in position, which is a pretty rapid cycle. And it makes it all the more important that you be effective in getting up to speed in a new role quickly, because every moment you gain by doing that is an opportunity to really have an impact on the organization. I should say too, we'll be sending you a copy of these slides, of course, so you can count on that. Also, if you have any questions, just type them in that Q&A box and I'll try to answer them as I go along if they come up, or you can save them if you wish for the end. But I think one of the things I've found with this work is just the benefit of having a framework, right? The benefit of having something to kind of organize yourself, your thinking. You know, I always say the first 90 days is not rocket science, right? There's no rocket science there. It's really distilled common sense. But a lot of the value comes in having that framework and set of tools to give you the confidence that you're really focusing on the right things in the end. And so as you think about the first 90 days, I just want to stress that there really is a big impact from using this particular framework in the right ways. We've done some research on this. This is a summary of a study I did with Egon Zender, where the results looking at this group of executives joining major companies was that they could get up to full performance in about 50% of the time that it would otherwise take. And that's actually a pretty wonderful impact, right? And obviously something I'm really very proud about. And if you look at the specifics of the impact, this is just a sense of, by using this framework, what do people find most helpful, right? And you can see different themes here from stakeholders, just having a plan, gaining insight into the team, understanding the culture, And certainly we're going to dig into some of these things in a bit more depth. But I think it's hopefully useful to see that there are quite, important dimensions of transition that you really, get a lot of benefit from if you apply this particular framework and set of tools. So why focus on transitions? Well, it's because what you do early on matters so much, because it sets the tone for everything that follows. And early on, we know from research on things such as the confirmation bias that people form opinions very quickly, and once formed, they're quite difficult to change. And so if you're successful in, getting up to speed effectively, building the right relationships, understanding the challenges, right, that can begin to create a sense of confidence that can propel you through your entire time in the role. And on the other hand, if you get yourself into trouble early, it can be very difficult to reverse it. And I've had the unfortunate, experience a few times of being asked to coach executives that had got themselves into a lot of trouble, right? Maybe 6 months into the role, they've alienated some key stakeholders, something about their leadership style has rubbed people the wrong way. They're abrasive in some way or another. And there's really very little they can do, or in fact, I can do to help them at a stage like that, because opinion is hardened. The conventional wisdom has kind of surrounded someone with a bit of a gray cloud, and that's going to undermine everything they do, because people are just looking for them to do more of it and feed into that set of perceptions. The flip side is that, if you're successful in gaining some credibility early, you get a bit of a halo, and that halo is something that insulates you a bit, right, against what goes on next. Doesn't mean you can make terrible choices later and it's all going to be fine, but there is a bit of a cushion, if you will, that comes from having a successful transition. That quote, "You never get a second chance to make a first impression." Well, Rogers, the humorist, true, but also in the case of taking a leadership role, a new one, you often don't even get a first chance to make a first impression, because as we'll talk about, you come with a reputation, a set of expectations that surround you, really, before you even arrive in the role. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move forward. So I was, one leader whose transition I didn't advise on, but I studied after the fact, was someone who came out of a large industrial company, I won't specify the company, with a lot of experience in product development, and was hired by not a startup, but an early stage company that was just about to really take off, with a view that he would be the new sort of chief operating officer and bring discipline and systems to the organization. And, this was an organization that at that point had about 2,500 employees, was kind of just poised to take off, and recognized, the CEO recognized that, they needed to become more systematic and structured in order to scale. But it went very badly wrong, because the culture was so different, because this person didn't really have a clear understanding of their mandate. They came in sort of understanding or thinking that they could just simply put in place processes and systems, when there wasn't really broader support for doing that. They didn't focus enough on building those critical peer relationships with others on the leadership team. And in general, they just were the wrong person for the role, because they didn't have enough experience in leading what was basically a transformation. And so, they probably made 4 of the 5 traps or fell into 4 of the 5 traps that you see here, right? They stuck too much with what they know. They thought they knew, they came in with the answer. They were engaging in the wrong kinds of learning. We'll talk a little bit more about that. They weren't spending enough time on peer relationships. But the key thing here is to just understand from a starting point that there really are some common traps that leaders fall into in transition, and you don't want to fall into those, right? This was among the first pieces of research I did on transitions, which was just looking at what are the common mistakes that people make. I want to emphasize that sticking with what you know is number one for a reason. right? It's the most common reason I see people struggle. You see the Mark Twain quote, right? To a person with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Or you think about Marshall Goldsmith's again, what got you here won't get you there. One key thing you have to do early is understand in what ways do you need to change what you do? And we'll focus on, given the demands of this role, what do you need to embrace that perhaps is challenging or difficult or something you don't love to do? What do you need to let go of? And that's a mental discipline that I always take the people I coach through from the outset, right? What do you need to embrace? What do you need to let go of? Because it's typically the case that your skill set is not a perfect match for what you need to do. I mentioned the kind of the idea of momentum and, you know, getting up to speed, but there really is a kind of a dynamic to this, a non-linear dynamic, right? If you do the wrong things, and it's often rooted in not doing a great job of learning and not doing a great job of connecting, you can make some bad calls, you can not, you know, build the alliances that you need, and this can really undermine your ability to do what you need to do and ultimately contribute to these sorts of vicious cycles. So don't do that. You know, good transitions often are based, as you see at the bottom of this second diagram, on being effective at building those key relationships, alliances, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, but also engaging in the right kind of learning so you can make the right early decisions, you can focus on the right things, you can build a strategy and a vision that really is attractive in the context of the organization. So keep in mind that transition to me is very much about how do you build momentum, positive momentum, and avoid negative momentum in the context of the role that you've taken. So as you think about a framework for doing this, and this is an extension of work that I did in the first 90 days, reflecting subsequent research and building tools and so on. What you see here is a framework that is intended to kind of give you a roadmap, if you will, for progressing through your transition. I'm just going to take you through some of the elements of this, hopefully get you to think a little bit about how this might apply to you. These separate 9 elements, and I'm going to really start with this whole idea of getting started. So I just got a question, and I'm gonna address it very quickly, but come back to it. How to handle discriminatory behavior in the workplace as a female leader. That's a really, really, really large topic, right? And I think it almost always begins to show up in transition, right? So you often get an intimation that this is going to be an issue. I guess I'd be asking, you know, was there due diligence about the culture of this organization? Is it a cultural issue, or is it an issue of a specific individual? You know, is it systematic or individual? I think is part of it. You know, there are standard answers, as I'm sure you know, to these things. Go talk to HR. You know, talk to your boss, unless it is your boss. The reality is that often HR and others are not terribly helpful, right? And I've seen, you know, pretty senior female leaders get themselves into really challenging situations where it was clear that there was bias involved, but very difficult to, in quotes, prove it, real limits on your ability to kind of go and get, you know, solutions for it. I know I'm not really giving you answers here, but I think that to me, part of this is about, first of all, don't try not to take a role where you're setting yourself up for that, but there's often no way to know that completely in advance. Make sure as part of the transition process that you're building alliances broadly, because that can help you deal with these kinds of challenges. But the more general issue of, you know, what's different for women in transition as leaders is, to me, a fascinating one, and one I'm actually, it's coincidental, just had a meeting to talk about. So as you think about the getting started process, there's a couple of things I would emphasize here. The first is understanding the types of transitions that you're going through. And it's often, in fact, usually multiple types of transitions in parallel. And so treat this as a little bit of a checklist. Think perhaps of the last time you went into a new role, or perhaps you're going into one now. How many of these applied to you? that example I gave you of the leader that derailed, and I should have said he did derail, he was out of the organization after about 9 months. There were many transitions going on here, right? Onboarding into a new company, he was promoted to a higher level. He actually did move geographically, right? He was moving from a functional role in product development, although there was some cross-functional dimensions to it, to a truly cross-functional role. I didn't say it, but it was a newly created type of role. He was coming out of an organization that was very much kind of about sustaining success and realigning into something that looked more like an accelerated growth scenario. I'll talk about that in a minute. So there were many, many dimensions to the transition. And the more types of transitions that you're going through, the greater the risk. Now, there's no easy antidote to this, although you have to be very careful about taking roles that involve too many dimensions, right? You got to be thoughtful about the size of the leap you want to make. Or if you are taking a big leap, what kind of support is going to really help you in those circumstances? It's also quite valuable to kind of pull it apart and think about which parts of this are, you know, really challenging. Is it adapting to the new company culture? Is it learning to operate at a higher level? Is it managing multiple functions or specialties when you've been more of a specialist? And the more precise you can be about the nature of the challenge, the better you're able to then mobilize to meet it. The other thing I always recommend is, you know, be thoughtful about how you're going to arrive and the preparation you're going to do before you're formally in the role. That's obviously educating yourself about the organization, about the position, assuming you've got some time to do that, which is usually the case. But it's also anticipating what the reaction to your arrival is going to be, right? What are people going to think they know about you before you arrive? What dimensions of that are good? What you're going to be a little bit problematic, you're going to have to deal with. Really be thoughtful about crafting the messages you want to send about yourself and your leadership as you arrive, and plan, you know, in some detail how you're going to engage in that early communication and connection work. So that's really dimensions of what you might think of as the you know, get started kind of role for this, or piece of this overall framework. Then there's 3 pieces here that I think of as really diagnostic, right? There's accelerating your learning, there's matching your strategy to the situation, and there's gaining alignment with key stakeholders, especially your boss, but potentially with others too. Just go through each one of these in turn. Oh, that's a great question. Anything to emphasize or pay attention to while joining a new company as the leader remotely? Yes. So I actually published an HBR Online article a couple of months back that we can send you the link to for that, about onboarding new leaders remotely. It's hard, right? Because the normal things you would do just to kind of gather information informally aren't there. It means you have to be much more structured about the learning process, and you need to ask the organization to help you with that process. It means you need to be much more structured and disciplined about connecting with people, and you want to ask the organization for some help to do that too. You know, and I guess what I would add that we find consistently is the biggest challenge is not dealing with your own team, your own new team, because you have the power to convene those people, to begin to direct them, to begin to connect with them, even if you feel a little isolated. Where it's really challenging is connecting with your peers, right? Where normally you might be able to, you know, much more organically interact with your peers, or your boss for that matter. Here it has to really be organized, and you need to kind of win their attention. And that's not necessarily easy, especially given all of what's going on right now. But Asha, I think as part of the follow-up, maybe we can send a link to that
Absolutely.
article. So a little on each of these 3 things, right? So accelerate your learning. I think it's, first of all, recognize there's distinct types of learning you might have to be doing. I divide it into technical learning, products, markets, technologies, systems, cultural learning, values, behavioral patterns, ways of doing things, right? Rights and wrongs, the value set of the organization, and then political learning, right? How are decisions made? Who has power? Who has influence? how do you navigate the corridors of power to get things done in the context of the new organization? And thinking about the relative balance, right? So the leader I mentioned earlier, the derailed leader, he was very focused on the technical learning side and not enough on understanding the culture or the political system in which he was arriving, which was almost kind of like a family, right? Or a tribe, right? They'd been together as they built this organization up to this point. And so, you know, he didn't do the work necessary to become part of the family, right? Or part of the tribe. And that was part of what really undercut him. Keep in mind that culture is like the organization's immune system, right? You have to be very careful not to do some things that can trigger the immune system. And examples are overestimating your mandate to make change, right? You may have been told you're there to make change happen, but that doesn't necessarily mean you really have a mandate. And so once you come into the organization, you really need to check and recheck that you have the mandate to do what you think you need to do, right? And if not, you need to kind of build and clarify that mandate. Coming in with the answer, right? No one likes to be told that you have the answer to problems they've struggled with. Even if you really do have the answer to the problems they've been struggled with, you still need to socialize. You need to deal with the reality of the egos that you're dealing with, and try to kind of, you know, embed progressively perhaps what it is you already know at some level you need to do. This is the last one, creating the sense you think there's no good here. This was something I learned, or not learned, but I saw very directly with a CEO I did some work with. I was coaching him as the new CEO of a big healthcare system in the US. And he was a very focused, disciplined, problem-solving, you know, trained originally as an engineer, you know, very operationally focused CEO. And in fact, the organization needed that. But in the process of beginning to connect and do his diagnosis and think about his agenda, all he focused on was the things that weren't working, right? He didn't kind of pay any attention to, you know, this is pretty good, or they've done good work there. And so the organization, when I did the set of interviews I usually do to kind of see how, you know, a new exec is doing, the feedback was he doesn't think we've done anything good here in the entire history of the organization. That was not what he thought, but he was creating the impression. And so I gave him this feedback, you know, as I do, and he literally sort of hit himself on the head and said, you know, I know, he says, I know, my wife always tells me, sprinkle a little sugar on it, dear, sprinkle a little sugar. And so there's a lesson here, I think, about the perceptions you can create as a new CEO or a new senior leader without really even intending to, right? And so being, you know, pretty thoughtful, right, about managing the impressions you're creating and balancing, right, the necessary focus on what needs to be worked on with, you know, the parts where the organization has done a good job. And, you know, I joke that there's no organization so dismal that it hasn't accomplished something good in its history, right, that you can find, which is akin to the Dale Carnegie advice, the famous advice about influencing people. Find something you like about this person, right? Even if it's a small thing, find something you can like about them. So hopefully clear about this. Culture, you know, is a complex subject. I'm not going to deal with it in any detail beyond saying that most transitions, even if you're moving internally, involves some dimension of adapting to a new culture. It could be a new functional culture. It could be a new part of the organization. It could be that the culture at more senior levels is subtly different than the one you're currently, you know, working with or in. And so understanding that culture has levels, right? The surface level of terms and acronyms that people use and symbology, the bottom level of those fundamental assumptions and values, but really that critical middle level of behavioral norms where I think you need to focus your attention. I give you some thoughts in the slides. Again, we'll be sharing the slides with you about ways, dimensions of those behavioral norms to take a look at and questions to ask, right? And of course, in the first 90 days itself, there's more about how to do this kind of diagnostic work. So, you know, that's accelerates your learning. There's obviously much more to that. In the end, it's really about creating a learning plan and understanding where you're going to get the insight you need, and how to be as efficient as possible in getting that insight. Second piece of diagnosing your situation is understanding what type of business situation you're in, or mix more typically, and how that really influences the way you think about transitioning, right? And so I built this little framework, STARS model: startup, turnaround, accelerated growth, realignment, sustaining success. Not the sum total of all possible business situations, but a reasonable categorization. And by going through the process of thinking about what you're dealing with, it gives you insight into, for example, how you should, show up, right? The kind of style, the kind of approach that's going to be helpful. I like to contrast turnarounds with realignments, and there was another leader I worked with a few years back who came out of Europe in an organization, global food organization, where he'd done a big turnaround and moved into a position in the US, promotion that really was a realignment. And a lot of what he needed to do was really adjust his approach, right? Because he was really good at turnarounds. He was very action oriented. He was very decisive, come in and do the analysis, figure out what needs to be, what triage needs to be done right away, put in place the plan, replace most of the team. Whereas the new job was really very different, right? It was about evolving an organization, transforming elements of its culture, making it operate in a more integrated way. And there it was much more about, convincing people and building allies to, engage the organization in the necessary transformation of its culture and to some degree of its structure. And so, and there he wasn't replacing people. He was working mostly, there was an exception, with the existing leadership team. And so this framework can be very helpful in how you sort of just orient yourself from the start, really, to engaging with the organization. The example I gave you of the leader that derailed, that was an accelerated growth situation where the name of the game was to put in place structures and systems to allow scaling to happen. Now, the reality is that there may be an overall theme, but there may be different parts of what you inherit that are in different states. And it can be a really useful exercise to think about those, but also engage your team in a dialogue about how they see the nature of the business situations. And I often work with teams to get them to sort of, reach consensus about what the state of different parts of the organization is, because that's a great place to start with what the work is that you need to do there. So the third dimension of that piece about really, diagnosing your situation is about having the right conversations with, first of all, your boss, but perhaps with key stakeholders. I'm not going to go into this in detail beyond saying that there's some obvious stuff here and there's some not so obvious stuff here. The obvious conversations, and by conversations, I don't mean a one-time conversation, it's more a topic that you need to deal with, is focusing in on those expectations and the resources available to you. It's easy to miss the other two, right? Style, which is really how are you going to work most effectively with your boss? How do they prefer to be communicated with, right? Are they someone who prefers to talk or prefers to communicate via other means, written means of some form? How much detail do they like? What kind of frequency of interaction do they want? And if you can sort of explicitly discuss that up front, it can really help a lot in terms of you building that key relationship. And the number two conversation is around the situation. And this is being sure that you and your boss and perhaps others are on the same page about the nature of the STARS situation, right? We're in turnaround as opposed to we're in realignment, right? As opposed to we're in sustaining success. Because, and I hope it's obvious, if you have a different view than your boss, and oh, by the way, your team, this can create all kinds of challenges, right? And so reaching alignment on your understanding of those things is really pretty critical. The middle box here, establishing direction, this is one I don't find leaders struggle with too much, because I think the very business processes of most organizations help focus you on, creating the strategy, creating the goals, long-range financial planning, and so on. But just to summarize, to me, the essence of establishing direction in an organization is about the what, the how, and the why, right? What is it we need to do? Think of that as mission, goals, priorities. How are we going to do it? Think about this as strategy, not in the grand sense of corporate strategy, but strategy in terms of the how of what we're going to do, and why. Why should people get excited? What's inspiring about what we're going to do? And that really gets us into things like vision and purpose. And so, you know, if you go deeper into this, it's really about how do you answer these questions and do it in a way that really people find compelling, that, you know, makes it clear, you know, what needs to be done, that taps into we're going to be on the same page with the strategy, that hopefully provides a sense of vision or purpose around people can rally. So Laura just asked a question: any advice for a situation in which you're joining a startup in a new position that still has not been very well developed? Yeah. So, you know, a distinct category, Laura, is, I think of it as the newly created position. And this is typically much harder than, I'm sorry to say, than established positions. Why? Because you need to work to define what that role is, right? And really put some, you know, some substance into how you're going to create value in the context of that role. And what's particularly challenging about it is that it may overlap with other people's roles. And there may be points of friction where, you know, person A thinks that's what they're there to do, when it's pretty clear to you, you know, that you're there to do that. What's critical here is making sure that your boss, or in this case, maybe the CEO or others, goes through the work of supporting you in defining what your role needs to be. Because the more ambiguity there is about the role, the less clear it is about how you're going to create value, the less clear about what it is that success looks like, less clear about how success will be measured, is just going to create a lot of trouble for you. Right now, does it mean if there's ambiguity you're doomed? No, but it means that you've got to typically, you know, build relationships, more work to kind of lay out what the, you know, the role really is all about. So Laura, hopefully that's helpful. It is an interesting challenge to be sure. So as you think about direction too, one thing I wanted to mention, and you know, link to an article that we can give you, is it's great to establish goals, it's great to establish strategies, it's great to establish a sense of vision, but you have to also focus, you know, in great detail on exactly what it is the organization is and is not doing. Because, you know, I sometimes say the real strategy of the organization is the sum of the activity that people are engaged in. And so I co-authored 2018 this article. It's called Too Many Projects, but the subject is really initiative overload. And how do you really define the core, most important initiatives that are going to support the strategy, achieve the goals, as opposed to kind of layering more stuff on top of it? And how do you go through the exercise of really, you know, looking hard at the full set of activities and deciding what to stop doing? Because that's really so critical. And so again, we'll provide you with a link to that article. So, you know, you've gotten started successfully understanding your types of transitions, you've accelerated your learning, you've thought about the STAR situation and how you're going to show up as a leader, you've gained some alignment with your boss and key stakeholders. Based on all that insight, you've begun to establish direction for your organization. So then it's really now beginning to have an impact, right? And so those three boxes you see in the, you know, the light, you know, lime green, if you will, on the right-hand side, are about how do you begin to really have an impact and start to deliver results in the organization. So a little bit on each one of those. So I think it's Shin, I'll add a degree work stop point is super critical. The act of asking for someone's preferences and sure is critical and builds trust. Totally agree with you, right? Discussing values, yes. At a minimum, being aware of your own values, right? And making sure that even before you take the job, you know, that organization is going to be reasonably aligned with your values and not put you in situations that are counter to it. So thank you, Chanel. That's a great observation. Building the team, so big subject in its own right. We could spend an entire day talking about, you know, taking over a leadership team, inheriting one and beginning to reshape it. But I think that's the starting point, is to understand that you don't typically get to build your team. Sometimes you do, You know, it's a new position, it's a role that hasn't existed before. You get to build a team. It's a from the ground up startup of something, maybe a new project, you get to build your team. But the reality is usually you inherit somebody else's team. And it's a team that's been shaped and run by your predecessor. When you arrive, it's not your team. Your objectives may be different than your predecessors, you know, because of the demands of the business. And so, you know, this is a very different challenge than, in quotes, building a team, right? It's a challenge of assessing that team and evolving it into what you need it to be in whatever time frame makes sense given the situation you're in, right? While continuing to have the organization operate and achieve necessary results. Will the presentation slides be available following the webinar? Yes, they will. We'll get you a copy of the presentation slides. So the analogy I use is leading a team you inherit is like repairing an airplane in mid-flight. Again, a lot to this, right? There's how do you engage in the process of assessing a new team? What are you looking for in your team members? Are there roles that are particularly critical that you want to focus on making sure you've got the A players in first? And there's the delicate dance of evolution, right? Of making changes without overwhelming the organization with too much change. It's a fascinating challenge. I actually wrote an article, another HB article we can give you a link to, leading the team you inherit, that gets into that one in a bit more detail. I'd also say it really helps if you've got a model or a framework for thinking about what you're looking for in your team, right? And so this is something I use that, you know, I think is helpful about, especially for leaders who are taking new roles. You know, the high-performing team you want to create has the right people in the right roles, is powerfully aligned, operating efficiently, and collaborating effectively. Now we could talk about each one of those, right? How do you get the right people in the right roles? Notice it's about people, but it's also about roles. Sometimes you've got good people, but they're not in the right role. Sometimes you need different role structure. At a minimum, you need to focus on what are your most critical roles first and make sure you've got the people that you need there to really achieve in them. Powerful alignment, this is going beyond just having, you know, shared goals, shared strategies. It's about a sense of purpose. It's about really understanding each other at a pretty deep level, really rowing. Both my sons are crew athletes, rowing together, right? Going in the same direction. Operational efficiency, this is about how you actually run the team, right? The cadence of meetings, the way meetings are run. You've got a lot of control over that as a new leader, right? And so you can think about, well, how did my predecessor do that? But also, how do I want to do it, right? To make sure I'm really getting the most out of this team with the time we spend together. And of course, collaboration, right? The secret sauce of making people comfortable enough to engage in tough issues, to have each other's backs, to feel like you're involved in something that's a true joint effort. And again, these are just starting points, but you know, again, we'll give you links to these articles, the relevant one here, leading the team you inherit. Securing early wins, back to momentum, right? Back to how am I going to begin to have an impact? Early on, it's about credibility. It's about connection. It's about positive impression. But you don't get very far in before you need to be thinking about where you're going to focus your effort to really begin to have, you know, a clear, measurable impact, or at least observable impact on the organization. And so there's a whole, process you need to go through of really, you know, thinking hard and distilling down to what are the key areas that you're going to focus a lot of attention on. And you can't take on too many, right? You've really got to place your bets, enough bets, right? That if, you know, something doesn't pay off, you're still, you know, going to make some progress, but not too many, lest you get sort of so dispersed. Getting wins in the right ways, this is about understanding the culture, right? And understanding the way you go about doing things should be consistent with the culture, unless you're trying to change it, and that's a whole nother topic. Taking the star situation into account, what I mean by that is the way you go about getting wins in a turnaround is very different than what a win looks like in a realignment or an accelerated growth situation. Chanel, when taking renewals, I've been told to make my personnel changes super quickly, particularly the firings. I feel there's some level of observation of data that helps in making this decision alongside some intuition. So the only place I don't go with this statement is the super quickly part. I think it really depends on the situation. In a turnaround, absolutely. In a realignment or sustaining success environment, maybe not so quickly. What is absolutely true, Chanel, is that if you let very much time go, the team becomes your team in a deeper sense, and making changes becomes more difficult. As a rule of thumb, and it's just a rule of thumb, I'm back up, right? You don't want to pull the trigger, without really giving people a decent chance, right? Because what you observe may not be correct. Even what you've been told might not be correct. Now, again, there are political realities and constraints here, right? My rule of thumb is by the 90-day mark, I want to be very clear on the major changes I want to make in my team. If it's a turnaround, I may need to operate more quickly than that. Doesn't mean I've made all the changes, but I've got a sense of what changes I need to make, and I've begun to put in place the process for dealing with that. Any perspective on managing extremely different generational groups? Wow, another huge topic, right? So, wow, I don't even know if I can do that one justice, right? Because it's such a big group, or such a big topic. I think, obviously this is a problem that takes care of itself as the new generation, takes command, if you will. In the interim, it can be a source of tremendous, frustration and conflict and loss of potentially great people, right? You've got to hope that you've got a leadership that's tuned into some of this. Sometimes some forms of reverse mentoring can help. But again, there's no easy answer here, especially if you're a leader leading people who are a lot older than you are, right? And you're the kid, right? Now, the answer is, as it always is, but just harder, which is you need to, demonstrate that you're capable of leading them in an effective way. There's no, real answer beyond that. Do I do one-on-one coaching? Yes, I do. Typically now, pretty much exclusively at the C-level. The best way to reach me always is through LinkedIn, right? So I really welcome LinkedIn connections. I do my own LinkedIn, communication. So probably the best way to reach me. Lucas, how to balance the need for sense making and not rushing to action and decision before fully understanding the context, while at the same time securing early wins. So Lucas, this is such a great question, right? And so, when I do programs, on the first 90 days, these days, virtual programs, I emphasize the need to strike the right balance between learning and connecting versus deciding and acting. The right balance depends a lot on the situation, right? In a turnaround, you're going to have to operate much more quickly, but the learning you need to do is in some ways easier. The analytics that you need to do, whereas if you're in something more like a realignment, you need to, perhaps take more time to do that sense making, as you describe it. And I love the term, to really understand. You can fall off either side of this, right? I've seen people who, take action too early because they feel this pressure to prove that they, the powers that be made the right decision and putting them in place. I've seen people who wait too long, right? And therefore people are starting to ask, well, what is this person doing, right? There's not a hard and fast rule for doing this, right? You're never going to have 100% of the information you need to make some key decisions. So you have to be comfortable with having 80 to 90% of the information that you need or insight that you need. But the first step is to do what you just did, Lucas, which is recognize you have to strike the right balance. And often, at least for the executives I work with, you can kind of negotiate that a little bit up front before you even get in, right? I'm going to go in and I'm going to do a 45-day assessment and come back with a summary assessment and a plan for what I'm going to do, would be an example. You also need to stay tuned to the currents of the organization to make sure that you're not letting frustration build too much because you're not acting. Another strategy, by the way, is, so I one time had an interview, I interviewed the former CEO of CVS, big pharmaceutical organization at that time, only in the US. And he said, you know, early on, I want to create the impression that I'm decisive, but have decided not to decide yet on some key issues. And so what he would do is pick some small things and make some choices to sort of demonstrate his decisiveness, but also win some time to engage in the sense-making process that you're describing. So final piece substantively in terms of delivering results, creating alliances. This is really about mapping the stakeholders in the organization, understanding where what you're trying to do lines up with what other people are trying to do, understand if there's ways you can support other people in what they're trying to do to build relationship capital, looking at the networks of the organization, thinking about how you're going to engage in influence. Again, a big subject, right? Before I was a business school professor, I was a professor of diplomacy at the Kennedy School of Government, where I was doing research on international negotiations. And so I took a lot of the ideas about what great diplomats do in terms of thinking, in terms of alliances and advancing agendas, and sort of pulled it into that part of the first 90 days. So finally, there's the managing yourself process. And you notice this is underneath everything, right? Because it really is about how do you manage your energy and yourself through what can be, sorry, just a sec. Through what can be both a very exciting, but also very stressful time. And to me, a lot of it's about managing your energy through that process. But again, there's a few things that I think help. Making sure you're taking time to step back, reflect, and plan, and not getting completely immersed in things and not getting the requisite perspective. Ensuring you're focusing on the right things. I'm not going to go through the whole list. Tapping into and managing your energy. And critically, I think, especially at more senior levels, building your advice network, right? As someone who works with CEOs in transition, probably the most important thing I do is give them someone, you know, who I think is reasonably thoughtful and certainly wants to help, someone to talk to when they can't really talk to anybody else, or they have a very small number of people that do. And so for leaders at all levels, I think focusing on making sure you build that advice network, because that's really going to help you keep your equilibrium, make good choices as you move through the transition process. So that's the framework. I guess I would just say too that, you know, the way I sort of think about this and the way I've tried to implement it is to look at this not just as a framework for helping individual leaders take new roles, but also a framework for helping organizations accelerate everybody, right? And so the work I do these days really is about implementing this framework as a system, an acceleration system in the context of organizations. Why is this important? Because there's so many transitions going on at any given point of time in organizations, right? If I was able to pull you directly and ask you, you know, do you have someone who's working for you who's in transition, a peer in transition, a boss in transition, et cetera, most of you would be having at least, you know, one other person's transition impacting what you're doing, and it might well be several, you know? And so when you begin to look at organizations through the lens of transition, what you see is there's just a sea of it going on all the time. Teams are changing, individual leaders are taking new roles, right? There's this constant shifting, even more today, I should say, than there was, you know, previously. And that's both a problem because those transitions can contribute to disruption, loss of knowledge, right? Loss of focus, but also an opportunity because if you can implement this kind of framework organization-wide, you can really speed up everything that's going on in the organization, right? And so just thinking a little bit, stepping back and thinking about the impact of of transitions on your organizations. Also, are there critical sets of transitions that are going on that may need to be accelerated, right? So, you know, large global sporting goods company, you know, doing some work with, has a whole group of senior executives that are simultaneously taking new roles, and we're working with them to create a process, right, based on our stuff, that really will help them move together, right, into the future. And partially that's, you know, and all virtually, by the way, partially that's content like this, but it's also group coaching, small group coaching, it's individual coaching. So you can really, really dramatically speed up not just the transitions, but also the connections and support networks between groups of executives that are going through transitions in parallel. So Harvey has a question. I've been announced in a new role from 1/1/21 with a rolling transition till then. It feels dangerous not to have a real start. Are there ways to manage this gray transition? Yes. So this is not fun, right? And it's especially not fun if there's an incumbent playing your role and you're kind of there as understudy waiting to take the role. I don't know the details, obviously, Harvey, of what you're facing. So look, regardless of how long this is, I think you do need to have a formal start at the time when the time comes, right? Even if it feels like you've been around forever. I think you need to tread carefully, you know, early on in terms of getting too engaged in decision making, unless that's what you're being asked to do. It's certainly an opportunity to learn a lot about the role, begin to make those critical connections with people. Where you don't want to go is a place where there begins to become ambiguity about who's really in charge. And because that never ends well in my experience, right? And so I'd be really careful about that. And then when the time comes, make sure there is a formal handoff, right? That there's a moment when it's clear that the transition really has happened. So that would just be a couple of pieces of advice I would give to you, Harvey. Not going to go into this in detail, right? I think this is just the benefits for both the individual and the organization of putting in place these kinds of, you know, transition acceleration systems. So with that, we're at sort of 5 minutes to the hour. If there's any additional questions, I'm delighted to take them on, Asha, or any questions you have that I might be able to address, and let's shift to that mode.
That was great. Thank you so much, Michael. I was taking notes, like your slide 7 with the vicious cycle and virtuous cycle, those system dynamics diagrams resonated with everyone in the room. That's one of the first classes that we take when we get to Sloan. So putting those pictures in front of us, I'm sure it clicked with everyone today.
Cool.
I really liked slide 27 about the energy. I think especially in the times that we're in right now and the new normal, it's important that we take care of ourselves. We know how to balance and practice self-care. And we're thinking about that. And I like the 8 points that you had listed on that slide. For me, plan was something else that resonated. And, you know, the first time I read the book, it was listen. So for me, you know, every time I hear about the book, listen to the book, something else resonates. And for me today, that's what it was.
Well, thank you. And I think it's, you know, I'm also a big fan of planning, right? But plan to learn. Plan your learning process, right?
Yes.
You know, engage in planning to leverage, you know, what you're trying to do. Be very efficient in your learning, right? Think about how you're going to do that. Be planful in how you're going to connect with key stakeholders, right? So, you know, it's obviously a mix of learning and adapting, but planning plays a really crucial role. Any advice on handling this is a question from Priya. Any advice on handling a situation where you are an external candidate successful in landing a job that an internal candidate didn't? Well, right, so this happens all the time, right? It's often the case also that congratulations, you're now leading the person who wanted to have the job. They know everybody, they know the culture. Depending on who they are, they, you know, maybe out gunning for you and wanting you to fail. That definitely happens. So the question then is, you know, you have to figure out very early on whether this person can get on board and accept you as a leader. And, you know, you have to kind of test and push that. And if the answer is no, then they have to find another role because you're going to be constantly undercut. But the best of these situations are ones where if they're good, right, that you successfully re-enlist them. And one way to do that is to show that you care about their advancement, that you're going to help them develop and continue their career, because often the number one concern for someone like that is, oh, is my career over? Right? I didn't get the job. This person's coming in from the outside. You know, it's the end. And so, you know, and again, there's a bit of art to this about knowing when and how to engage in that kind of conversation. Another question, how do you adjust your transition to a situation where you find understanding that your boss is on shaky ground with the board? Run away screaming is my answer, and I'm kidding. So difficult, right? Really difficult. And I agree with you. I've seen situations like this where, you know, your new boss is not entirely transparent with the fact that they may in fact be on their way out. You know, again, it comes down to building those alliances up, down, and sideways, doing the job as effectively as you possibly can, and recognizing that, you know, you will possibly face an uphill battle when, you know, if your boss is leaving and someone new is taking the job. Right? Because you're going to be viewed as their person, and you've got to be careful with that. I've seen situations like that where it wasn't possible for the person to build a successful relationship with the new boss after the boss that hired them left. I've seen other situations where their value was really recognized and they were given a decent chance. A lot of it really depends on who comes into that position next if it happens. But the number one piece of advice I would give you is do the job. Do the job as effectively as you possibly can.
That's so powerful. So on that note, with a minute left, Michael, thank you again for joining the Sloan Fellows and teaching us about leadership transitions. Again, your books are amazing. I'm so happy that we're going to host you twice this summer. As I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we'll be sending out an email from the Office of External Relations with a recording and a link to a landing page. That landing page will have the slides, the recording, and the articles that Michael mentioned that are all available through HBR. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Asha. Take care, everybody.